After class one day, I fell in with some students who were looking at their daily screen time averages on their phones. They showed me how to find mine, and I was shocked that some days I spend 2 hours looking at my phone. The stats helped me to understand this obscene indulgence. Email was the biggest one. Twitter was the next biggest one. I play Minesweeper while watching TV sometimes, and I look at Instagram for about 15 minutes a day. I don't feel too bad about what I'm doing on my phone, but still, 2 hours? I often think that if I had one more hour a day, what would I do with it? The truly scary bit is that some of the students in the group had screen times exceeding 6 hours a day. One admitted that she regularly hits 8. This was baffling to me. Why would you spend half your waking day looking at your phone? Don't you have friends? Homework? Sports and hobbies? Go read a book. And then I had the horrifying thought, don't you watch TV? I wondered, is this the fault of technology that just makes everything so continuously available? Then I wondered, is it postmodernism? People blame postmodernism for all kinds of things today. Perhaps it is postmodernism's fault. Seriously though, it just might be this time. So, what is postmodernism? It's pretty hard to nail down, but let's start by saying that it's mainly a rejection of modernism. I also want to clarify that there's a difference between philosophical postmodernism and cultural postmodernism, though they overlap quite a bit. In this video, I will be dealing with cultural postmodernism, the one that's in our faces and shaping our lives day to day. In order for us to get a handle on what postmodernism is, I want to create a collage of impressions. Then when we stand back and look at it at the end, we might have gained some idea as to what postmodernism is and how we might counter some of its more negative effects. The most important thing about postmodernism is right there in the name. It's the thing that comes after modernism. So you need to know about modernism. And if you need a refresher, watch my video. There's a link in the description. Remember the promises of the Enlightenment? Reason, science, and technology would lead to a better world? It was looking good in the 19th century, but the events of the 20th century showed that it was a load of hooey. Modernism failed. The Titanic is a bit of an allegory. The ship represented the best of human ingenuity. It was a scientific and technological marvel. At the launch of the Titanic, an employee of the White Star Line said, "Not even God himself could sink this ship." On April 15, 1912, it sank. On its maiden voyage, over 1,500 people died. Faith in the modern worldview wasn't shaken by the sinking of one ship, but it was rocked by the war to end all wars that started a little over 2 years later. Modernism promised progress on the backs of science and technology. Instead, science and technology were used to create machine guns, massive artillery, and lung-lacerating gas that resulted in the destruction of nearly an entire generation of young men in the nations that were considered the most enlightened. Modern science and technology had promised salvation, but delivered hell instead. Then came the pandemic that killed 50 million people globally. Science couldn't stop it. Then 10 years later, the global economy collapsed. 10 years after that, the Second World War. Now keep in mind, the main combatants in both world wars were the most enlightened nations of the world, the most scientifically and technologically advanced. One of these nations used science and technology on an industrial scale in an attempt to eradicate all of Europe's Jews. The final shreds of the idea that humanity was progressing went up the chimneys of Auschwitz. The war ended with the use of the atomic bomb on civilian targets. This bomb was the pinnacle of scientific and technological progress. This kicked off the Cold War with the other rationalist materialist superpower. Modernism had reneged on its promises. So we rejected modernism. Kind of makes sense. The rejection of modern principles moved into popular culture in the 60s and 70s. We didn't know where we were going, but we didn't like where we'd been. That's pretty much postmodernism. So what are the characteristics of cultural postmodernism? Let's start this collage. Like modernism, it is materialistic. Material is all there is. There is no transcendent anything. What we have here is not a picture of a created thing. It is just a bunch of rocks. The world is physical. There is no spiritual dimension. The second aspect I'll call the collapse of categories. Postmodernism rejects many or all of the so-called modern dichotomies, categories where they put clean lines between things, like nature and culture, or between public and private. Postmodern thinkers even challenged the distinction between subject and object. Modern thinkers drew a line between the object, the world of things, and the subject, the human mind that tries to understand the world of things. They believed that there are some things that you could know about an object. This is objective truth, and objective truth was universal truth. This coffee mug holds a certain number of milliliters of coffee in all places and at all times. It's a universal truth. It's a fact. You see how easily fact and truth can become the same thing? Anyway, an objective truth was thought to be completely different than a subjective one. Like, this cup is beautiful, or this cup makes coffee taste better. These truths reside in the mind of the subject. To the modern, subjective truth is inferior to objective truth. Now, postmodernism comes along and rejects the purity of objective truth. The number of milliliters a mug might hold is not a universal truth. There are many cultures in the world that wouldn't even consider measuring the capacity of a mug, let alone using the metric system to do it. So the measurement itself isn't objective. The truth is mediated by all sorts of cultural constructions. Scientific truth is mediated by the culture in which it is situated. So there's no objective truth, and consequently there's probably no universal truth either. Blurred lines and images represent the collapse of categories, and the idea that knowledge of something is always mediated. A third characteristic of postmodernism is that it resists metanarratives, or big stories. Postmoderns posit that there is no grand unifying story that makes sense of reality and gives meaning to history. 500 years ago, pretty much all of the West believed in the Christian metanarrative, the story of creation, the fall, redemption, and the fulfillment of all things at the end of history. It's a story that covers all of humanity. It doesn't just apply to Christians, it's true for everybody, whether they believe in it or not. Modernism had a metanarrative as well. It went something like this. All cultures are at different stages of development, but as they turn from religion and superstition to the principles of reason, they will progress and take their place among the great nations of the world. This story, too, applies to everyone, whether they believe it or not. To summarize, in the Christian era, we said Jesus is Lord. In the modern era, we said reason is Lord. In the postmodern era, we say there is no Lord at all. Without metanarratives, there are no absolutes. No such thing as universal good or evil, no universal truth or beauty. This relativism is why Christians are a little uptight about postmodernism. Part of our revulsion to postmodern relativism is a history of ungrounded certainty. So what I'm saying is that it's just as bad to claim a thing is relative when it isn't, as it is to claim a thing not to be relative when it is. More on this later. Anyway, without a single meta-narrative, we experience a kind of fragmentation. In the postmodern era, because there are no grand stories, we have smaller stories. We see this shift in universities. We used to study Christian, white male, Western history, literature, and art. But now there is inquiry into feminist, queer, black, First Peoples, and other stories as well. This leads us to another element in our collage. Postmodern culture is multi-storied. Without a single story, we find ourselves living within smaller stories. This is both a positive and a negative characteristic of postmodern society. For instance, unity under modernism came at the cost of a subjugation of all stories under the one story. But this mosaic of smaller stories can lead to conflict, especially when it comes to things like politics, religion, race, and sex. In these conflicts, it often happens that my group's position is absolutized, while the position of every other group is relativized. There's no longer any higher common authority to which we can appeal to justify our position. So we shout. I don't need to explain this. We hear a lot of shouting these days, and social media is a great place for shouting. A great place to absolutize and relativize, and that can turn violent. Metanarratives suppress people and their voices, but not having metanarratives leads to a cacophony of shouting and sometimes violence. Which is better? It depends, I suppose, on where you are in the hierarchy under the metanarrative. So the thing about shouting, if you shout loud enough and long enough, perhaps you convince yourself that you're right, and maybe you can convince yourself that you exist. And this brings us to another element in our collage. As postmodernism critiques modernism, someone is bound to ask if there's any such thing as an individual self. Isn't the existence of the subject another metanarrative? The idea of the individual soul is linked to the Christian metanarrative. The idea of the autonomous individual is part of the modern metanarrative. If there are no metanarratives, who am I? In a postmodern framework, you might just be an effect of social forces, and possibly an illusory one at that. So, there is no me? From what I've read, it seems like the jury is still out on this one, but the self is not standing on as sure a ground as it did in the past. Some say that your identity is grounded in one of the smaller stories. So at this time and place, the resident of the postmodern culture might be experiencing a bit of an identity crisis. It seems problematic to look outside oneself to a bigger narrative, but when we look inside, we don't really find any clear answers there either. I wonder if the selfie is a form of the individual shouting into the void, "I exist!" Or at least building a sense of self through images. This is a far cry from the idea that each of us has inherent value because we are created in the image of God. So let's review where we've come so far. Postmodernism is materialist. It rejects the modern system of categorical distinctions and all metanarratives, insisting that other voices be heard, which can result in a lot of shouting and may result in the loss of the individual self. We will continue to create our postmodern collage in the next video, but I wanted to frame a Christian response to all this. Many Christians are lamenting the changes in society that are created by postmodernism, but not all of them are bad. We need to get away from the unbiblical ideas that infiltrated our understanding of the world in the modern era. Postmodernism helps us to do this. We know there is a big story that started in creation and goes through the fall and redemption and ends up in the new heavens and the new earth. We know that there's such a thing as absolute truth. The problem is, in the past, we behaved as if we knew exactly what the truth was, like we possessed it. Modernism had gotten into our heads, and even within the church had us insisting that our rigid certainties were right and their rigid certainties were wrong. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the light." We can't possess the truth because we can't possess Him. We can learn a few things from the postmodern critique. It's a reminder that we see through a glass darkly. This means that a lot of things under the sun are mediated and interpreted, perhaps more than we are comfortable with. I think Christians need to take a don't shout but show approach to our engagement with postmodern society. We need to stop shouting with our mouths and instead show with our lives that there is an above-the-sun perspective. Stop shouting and instead bear the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In the next video on postmodernism, we will finish our collage and circle back to what people are doing all those hours on their phones. They aren't just wasting time. I think it's a little scarier than that. Till next time, bye-bye.